I had just stepped out of the taxi after a long flight home from my sister's funeral in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, when the sight before me made my legs freeze in place. My mother's wedding dress, the only thing left after more than 40 years, was lying in the middle of the garden, drenched, muddy, treated like worthless trash. Kendra Lowell, my daughter-in-law, stood right at the doorway with her arms crossed. Her voice was so cold, even the evening breeze seemed to halt. "My son needs his own room. That pile of junk should have been thrown out ages ago." One sentence, one breath. That was all it took to shatter the grief I hadn't even had time to recover from. My son, Derek, stood beside his wife. He just shrugged, silent, as if none of this had anything to do with him. I bent down to pick up my parents' wedding photo. Before I could stand, Kendra turned on her heel and deliberately stepped on the glass. The sound of it shattering was sharp as a blade. A sliver of glass sliced into my hand, but I barely felt the pain. The sting in my chest was far worse. My throat tightened. My heart clenched. That was what it felt like to be humiliated, inside my own home. I didn't say a word. I simply raised my phone, photographed every detail, and sent it to one person, the only one who knew I had long sensed this moment would eventually come. That night, I didn't cry. I only whispered one sentence, like a vow. "If she wants a war, I'll make sure she tastes defeat right under this roof." If you're listening to my story, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Every comment is a footprint beside me on this path to reclaim what's mine. And if this opening made your chest tighten or made you angry on my behalf, don't forget to hit like, because what comes next will shock you even more. Stay with me. The door to the truth is only beginning to open. My name is Ramona Steele, 65 years old, living in the suburbs of Houston, Texas. I had just returned from Baton Rouge after my sister's funeral, the last person in the family who still called me little sister. The flight was long, my body exhausted, my heart hollow, but the scene in my front yard jolted me awake like a bucket of cold water thrown straight into my face. This house, the 2-story cedar home with dark brown shingles, has been my home for more than 30 years. I bought it after my husband passed away. I painted each wall myself, replaced every brick, wiped every speck of dust on the staircase. A lifetime of working as an accountant never made me wealthy, but it taught me to treasure details. Every corner of this home is sweat, memories, and love. And now those memories lay scattered across the lawn, soaked by rain, smeared with mud like trash. The wooden chest my brother built by hand in 1978 had been pried open. My mother's leather journal was smeared by rainwater until the ink bled. My embroidered tapestry had flown up the steps as if it wanted to escape the chaos. I walked slowly, bending down to gather each item as though I were picking up shredded pieces of my own past. Kendra still stood there, arms crossed, her stomach flat beneath the silk dress. "I told you already," she said evenly. "You have to move into the storage room out back. The upstairs bedroom will be the baby's room." I looked around. There was no sign of a nursery. No crib, no toys, no baby supplies. Just the perfect excuse to push me out of the space I had poured my life into preserving. I gave a small smile, a smile that never reached my eyes. "The storage room, huh?" "Yes," she replied, voice sharp. "That's where you can stay quiet." I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't beg. I simply turned and walked down the small slope behind the house. The wooden door to the storage room groaned as I pushed it open. Dampness and old dust filled the air. Inside was a dirty folding mattress, a single bare bulb on the ceiling, and a tiny window covered in cobwebs. No table, no chair, no blanket. A place I wouldn't even store old junk, yet now it was supposed to be my room. I sat on the mattress and took a long breath. Humiliation twisted inside my chest, but my tears still refused to fall. You know, in that moment, in the freezing little room, I began to realize something painful. Sometimes the ones who wound you the deepest aren't strangers. They're the very people you once protected with your whole life. The memory pulled me back to the first day we toured this house. Marcus, my husband, smiled and placed his hand on my back. "Look at it, Ramona. This is where we'll grow old together, where we'll hear our grandkids running through the halls." But Marcus died only 3 years later from late-stage liver cancer. He left when Derek was only 8 years old. The night before he passed, Marcus held my hand tight and said, "Promise me, don't let anyone take this house. It's the only legacy I can leave Derek." I promised. And for 30 years, I kept that promise. Yet now, sitting in this cold storage room, I wondered, if Marcus could see this scene, would he know that the very child he loved most was the one who pushed me down here? I took out my phone, photographing every corner of the room, every discarded item, every muddy footprint on the floor. I used to think I understood Kendra, polished, charming, good at making people believe her story. The day Derek introduced her, I was genuinely happy. I thought my son had finally found someone to walk through life with him. I never imagined that someone would be the person slowly pushing me out of his life, bit by bit, until I became nothing more than an outdated thing to be tossed aside. That night, Derek came home late. The storage room door opened slightly, hallway lights spilling in. "Mom," he said tiredly, "don't worry about it. Kendra's stressed. She needs space." I looked at the son I had once trusted with everything. "And what about you?" Derek avoided my eyes. "You know, my wife will always come first." The door closed with a soft click. Darkness swallowed the room again. I unlocked my phone and checked the secondary account I had given Derek for emergencies. A list of transactions appeared. Interior design, $12,800. Baby room paint, $3,400. Maternity spa package, $2,500. Weekend in San Antonio, $7,900. Each line felt like a blade carving into my heart. Nearly 6,000 more in just 2 months, and I knew this was only the tip of the iceberg. I remembered Kendra talking about selling old things to refresh the house, and suddenly, everything clicked. She had sold my memories to fund her luxuries. Late at night, I opened my contacts and tapped the name Attorney Franklin Webb, the lawyer who had helped me with insurance 10 years ago. I texted, "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., I need to meet you." He replied instantly, "What's going on, Mrs. Steele? Family issues?" I wrote, "Yes, and I need to protect what's left." Before sleeping, I heard a car pulling into the driveway. I peeked through the curtain. It was Kendra driving the ivory Lexus, the one she claimed she borrowed from a friend. The car light was bright enough for me to see the new designer handbag sitting on the passenger seat. The next morning, while I was taking out the trash, Mrs. Viola Sharp, my neighbor of nearly 20 years, called softly, "Ramona, I need to tell you something. Last week, I saw a man delivering several big boxes to Kendra. She said they were baby room decorations, but when I walked past, they were clearly shoes, bags, perfumes, all expensive." I nodded, thanked her. No need to ask further. In my mind, the pieces of suspicion finally assembled into a complete picture. I went back to the storage room. The dim light brushed across the wooden grains, as if they were trying to tell me something. I sat on the edge of the mattress, took out my notebook, and wrote the first line. March 14th, begin collecting evidence. Then I whispered, quietly but resolutely, "If I have to stay in the storage room, then I'll stay here as the plaintiff, not the burden." I closed the notebook and looked up at the dark ceiling. For the first time in years, I didn't feel weak. I felt like a woman who knew exactly what she was about to do. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the tiny dust-covered window of the storage room, I jolted awake with a weight pressing against my chest. I had barely slept a few hours. A stabbing pain forced me to brace myself with one hand as I sat up, breathing deeply to steady my nerves. Beside the folding mattress was my old suitcase containing the few things I had managed to rescue: a few sets of clothes, a chipped photo frame, and the expense ledger I had carried with me throughout my decades as an accountant at the city's architecture office. I opened the book. Neat, meticulous lines appeared. Every roof repair, pipe replacement, heater maintenance. Each entry logged with dates, costs, and contractor names. I once thought that habit was just an occupational quirk, but now it was the thing keeping me grounded. I turned on my laptop, logged into my bank account, and cross-checked each transaction with the ledger. On the very first line, my heart tightened as if someone had gripped it hard. Interior design, $12,800. Baby room decor, $3,400. Maternity spa deposit, $2,500. San Antonio weekend, $7,900. In 8 months, the total amount withdrawn from the secondary account I had given Derek for emergencies had reached $86,400. I didn't need to be an accountant to know this wasn't family spending. This was luxury, funded with my money. Have you ever felt this? That moment when you go through the numbers and realize the person you trusted most has been carving pieces off you bit by bit, using your own trust against you? It's the kind of moment that doesn't break your heart with a sound. It splinters it silently, deeply, and in ways that don't heal easily. I remembered the day Derek got married 10 years ago. I had voluntarily added his name to that secondary account, thinking it would help him if any emergency came up. I didn't know that emergency, in his and Kendra's eyes, meant weekend trips, designer bags, and pastel nursery walls I had never agreed to fund. I shut the screen, closed the ledger, and steadied my trembling hands. I went upstairs toward the living room to check further. The room that once held my mother's walnut cabinet, the one she saved up for an entire year to buy at an antique market in 1962, was now empty. In its place stood some glossy, modern, but soulless piece of furniture. I touched the floor. The lighter patch of wood where the cabinet once stood felt like an empty space inside my chest. Out on the back porch, the rocking chair my father always used was gone too, the one I had repainted just last year, still bearing the scratch on the left side. Only a lighter square remained, a trace of absence. I went back inside, opened my phone, and pulled up the Marketplace app, the one young people use to sell secondhand items. I typed, "Walnut rocking chair, vintage, Houston." Within seconds, dozens of results appeared. I scrolled, and my heart seemed to stop. A listing that had expired 3 days ago, but the thumbnail image was unmistakably clear. My father's chair, the same left side scratch. Below it, sold, $650. I set the phone down and took a slow breath. It was just a piece of furniture, but to me, it was a memory, a fragment of my life, and Kendra had sold everything, one item at a time. I didn't scream, didn't call Derek. I opened my laptop and created a new folder, Kendra File. I placed inside photos of items thrown into the yard, photos of the storage room, photo of the missing cabinet, rocking chair sale listing bank statements, saved ads. Each file was labeled clearly, like an investigation report. At my age, I know. Anger makes you weak. Evidence makes others afraid. From the drawer, I took out the small voice recorder I once used for meetings. I charged it fully, tested the microphone. The red light blinked steadily. As I was hanging my coat, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Kendra was on the phone, her voice low and razor-sharp. "Don't worry, baby. I told him already. The house needs to be refreshed for the baby. That old woman doesn't know anything about paperwork." A pause, then a soft, chilling laugh. "That's right. If this plan works, we'll have the whole house. Trust me." I closed my eyes, clenching my fist. I wanted to storm out, wanted to shout, but I forced myself to stay still. Kendra needed to believe I was ignorant, weak, defeated. When her footsteps faded away, I opened my eyes. My heart was still pounding. I opened my notes app and typed, "Call on March 15th, 8:27 a.m., captured later portion, check audio levels." I saved it and set my phone down. I brewed a cup of black tea and stared out into the small backyard. The daffodils I planted last year were still blooming, despite the weeds and fallen leaves around them. I thought of my mother, of my father, of my sister, whom I had just buried. They used to say, "You are the keeper of this home, but sometimes to keep a home, you must clear out what's destroying it." I took a sip. The mild bitterness spread across my tongue, and I understood. It was time to start clearing. I walked through the house, pretending to inspect furniture, but in truth, mapping the locations of important documents. I found the 1993 house deed, roof repair invoices, home insurance paperwork, bank records, all under my name. I placed them into a manila folder, sealed it, and tucked it into the locked drawer. As dusk settled over the house, I heard soft laughter from upstairs, glasses clinking, and a gentle jazz melody drifting from the bedroom speakers. A home once filled with love had become a stage where I was forced to play the harmless mother. But behind the curtain, I had my own script. On my computer, I created a subfolder under Kendra file. Dinner plan. I typed, date, March 17th. Location, main dining room. Objective, observe, record, capture reactions. Participants, Derek, Kendra, her parents. Plan, appear weak. Agree to give up room. Place voice recorder. Hide mini camera in flower vase. No arguments, only documentation. I reread it, deleted the word revenge, and replaced it with evidence. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth exposed. Before going to bed, I checked everything one last time. Voice recorder, fully charged. Phone, silent mode. Folder of documents, hidden securely. I lay down on the folding mattress as moonlight filtered through the narrow gap in the door. Inside me, the pain still lingered, but beneath that pain, something else was rising. Clarity. In the darkness, I whispered, "All right, Kendra, go ahead and think I don't know anything. But on that dinner night, you'll be the one who can't swallow." I smiled. The first smile since my sister died, not because I was happy, but because I knew that from this moment on, everything was about to change. The next morning, I woke up even before dawn. Last night's rain still lingered as a thin layer of mist, and the cold slipped through the cracks of the storage room door, making me shiver. I made myself a cup of black coffee, no sugar, no cream, then sat down at the small table in the storage room. The weak yellow light was just bright enough to reveal every wrinkle on my hands. In front of me was the manila folder I had spent the last few days preparing. Bank statements, photos of the belongings thrown into the yard, audio recordings, the house documents, and the expense ledger I had cherished almost my entire life. Everything was ready. I glanced at the clock. 7:40. My appointment with attorney Franklin Webb was at 9 a.m. at his office in the Buffalo Bayou area, downtown Houston. I took a deep breath, picked up the folder, put on my long raincoat, then drove my old Toyota Camry out of the quiet street. Every time the tires rolled through a puddle, I felt a little lighter, as if each turn of the wheel was taking me out of the darkness I had been pushed into all this time. Attorney Webb's office was in a red brick building along Buffalo Bayou. Inside, the faint smell of coffee mixed with the scent of old paper, the particular smell of places where people come to seek justice or to patch up their mistakes. Attorney Franklin Webb, a man in his 50s, graying hair, half-rimmed glasses, came out and shook my hand firmly. "Mrs. Steele, it's been a long time," he said. "When I heard your voice on the phone, it didn't sound good at all." I gave a thin smile. "Not good at all, Franklin." We sat down. I opened the folder and laid each set of documents on the table in a clear order. "These are 8 months of statements. These are the scene photos, and these are the original house papers." He skimmed through each stack, nodding slowly. "You've done absolutely everything right," he said. "Documenting, keeping evidence, preserving everything. Most of my clients only come when it's already too late." He stopped at the copy of the house deed. "The house is still only in the name of Ramona Steele, correct?" I nodded. "Correct. Derek never completed any transfer paperwork. I always said I'd leave it to him after I'm gone." Attorney Webb set his pen down, his voice firm. "Then that's the good news. Legally, you are still the sole owner. No one has the right to sell, rent, mortgage, or alter anything related to this property without your written consent." He leaned back slightly and continued. "Derek and his wife are currently residing there by permission, tenancy at will, under Texas law. That means if you choose to, you can terminate their right to stay at any time, as long as you follow proper notice procedures." I stayed silent. A feeling that was equal parts pain and relief rose up in my chest. This house, the work and blood of my entire life, was still recognized by the law as mine. If you were in my place in that moment, what would you do? Stay quiet so the family can stay peaceful? Or stand up, knowing that from here on, nothing would ever go back to the way it was? Sometimes the hardest question isn't, do I have the right? It's, do I dare use that right to protect myself? Attorney Webb pulled the whole file closer and picked up his pen to jot notes. "Now we get to the money," he said. "How much do you estimate the total loss to be?" I read slowly, as if each figure were a fresh cut. $86,400 withdrawn, not including the heirlooms, the walnut cabinet, the rocking chair, the embroidery, estimated at another $12,000. He nodded, writing everything down. "We'll fully appraise the losses and prepare a detailed schedule," he said. "Everything that was sold, withdrawn, or destroyed, it will all go into the claim for compensation." He opened his laptop, fingers moving quickly over the keys. "First," he said, "we protect your finances. I want you to do these things today. Change all your banking passwords, including your retirement accounts. Deactivate Derek's secondary card. Turn on transaction alerts via email for every account. Remove Derek's name from any utility bills if they're currently under joint names." I opened my notebook and wrote each line down, as if drafting a new balance sheet for my own life. "I'll get all of that done today," I replied. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you want to sue them right now?" I was silent for a few seconds. "Not yet," I said. "I want to give them one last chance to understand the consequences." He nodded, as if he had expected that answer. He quickly scribbled a few lines onto the sheet in front of him. "Then we'll start with a formal notice. In it, I'll propose a legal rental agreement for Derek and Kendra at $1,650 per month. A repayment plan for the $86,400 over 48 months, with a 2% interest rate to formalize the debt. An added breach clause. If they're more than 30 days late on any payment, the lease is immediately terminated and they must vacate the property within 21 days, in accordance with Texas eviction rules." I looked at him. Light from the window reflected off his glasses, hiding part of his eyes, but not the certainty in them. "And if they refuse to sign?" I asked. "In that case," he said slowly, "we'll file a civil suit and serve a lawful eviction notice. With the evidence you have, this case is very clear." I nodded slowly. "One more thing," I said. "I want a clause stating that the back portion of the house, the area where I'm living, must remain untouched. No one is allowed to enter, lock, or change the locks without my consent." He gave a soft chuckle and nodded. "You're as sharp as you were back when you were an accountant. I'll add that in." After a while, the room fell into silence. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and the midday sun was starting to shine down on the stream of traffic. I rested my hand on the folder and lowered my voice. "Franklin, I don't want to destroy my son. I just want him to understand that respect isn't something given by default. It's something maintained through actions." He looked at me, his gaze softening. "I understand, Ramona, but sometimes, for people to truly understand what respect means, you have to let them face real consequences." He slid a stack of papers toward me and pointed to the last line. "This is the legal authorization, so I can represent you throughout the entire process." I took the pen and signed my name, the stroke of the pen steadier than I expected. As the tip lifted from the paper, it felt like I had just laid the first brick in the final wall of protection for my life. "The letter will be sent within 48 hours, he said. "You'll receive 1 copy by email and 1 printed copy sent to your home. I'll also prepare a backup copy in case they try to claim they never received it." I nodded and put the documents back into the folder. Before I stood up, Attorney Webb asked, "Do you want me to list the cause as a dispute over property usage rights or as unlawful occupation?" I gave a faint smile. "List it as unlawful occupation. I want them to read it very clearly." We shook hands again. His grip was warm, firm, and gave me a rare sense of safety in the midst of all this chaos. As I stepped out of the building, I realized the rain had completely stopped. Sunlight glinted off the water, making the surface of Buffalo Bayou shimmer like a silver ribbon cutting through the city. I stood still on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the lingering dampness in the air, listening to the sparrows on the nearby rooftop. It had been a long time since I'd felt this calm. Not because everything had been resolved, but because for the first time in years, I knew for certain I was doing the right thing. I got into the car and turned on the radio. An old jazz track started playing, the kind Derek used to put on as a child whenever he sat at the kitchen table to do his homework. I gave a sad little smile, but didn't turn it off. I let the music carry me back along the road home, the road where now, more than ever, I knew that every brick, every shingle, every window still bore my name, and deep inside, a voice rose up, slow but clear. Fairness and respect. That's all I've ever wanted, and this time, I'm going to get it. I got a text from Derek at noon. "Mom, let's have dinner together tonight as a family. Kendra wants everyone to talk calmly and find a solution." A solution? I smiled faintly and closed my phone. The same people who had treated me like a burden, who had pushed me down into the storage room, were suddenly talking about calm conversations and finding solutions. I knew this kind of mediation. The script was already written, every role assigned, and I knew very well which role they planned to put me in tonight. I could barely eat all day. I spread out all the documents Attorney Webb had prepared on the table, checked each page again, then slipped the thick letter into my handbag. In the late afternoon, I bathed, brushed my hair, and put on the green knit dress, the one my sister once laughed at and said, "That one makes you look both elegant and unshakable." I stood in front of the mirror under the warm yellow light. The face looking back at me no longer showed only the sorrow and exhaustion of the past weeks. What remained was a stillness, cold, clear, and sharply alert. Around 6:30, the smell of food filled the house. Roasted meat, sauce, buttered bread. Dinner looked far more elaborate than usual, like a carefully staged setting for a civil conversation. I walked upstairs, hearing voices drifting from the dining room. Kendra stood in the kitchen, hands busy, mouth smiling. That smile was so well rehearsed, it was obvious it wasn't real. Her parents, Elliot and Lorraine Lowell, were already seated at the table, pouring wine as if this were a polite, ordinary social visit. I had never liked them. Elliot was the kind of man whose every sentence carried a hint of disdain. Lorraine always wore a half smile, as if she were constantly testing how much others could endure. "Ramona, you finally came up," Kendra said in a light but sharp tone. "We just want a peaceful dinner, no tension." I sat down facing them and glanced at the neatly folded white napkin in front of me. "I hope so too," I replied slowly. "It's been a long time since I've seen anything that even resembles peace in this house." Dinner began. Knives and forks tapped plates in a steady rhythm. For the first few minutes, no one said much, just the sound of wine being poured and Lorraine's soft laugh as she talked about an acquaintance who had just opened a senior care facility in Austin. "It's truly wonderful," Lorraine said, glancing at me. "At your age, having a quiet place with proper care is what anyone would want." Elliot nodded, backing her up. "Exactly. At this stage, living together can be inconvenient for both generations. A retirement home makes things easier for everyone." I set my fork down and looked up. "You're talking about me, aren't you?" Lorraine took a sip of wine, pretending to be polite. "Oh, we're just making a suggestion. Kendra said you've been very tired. Derek worries about you too." I smiled lightly, a smile that made the whole table fall silent for one beat. "I'm not tired," I said. "I've just been busy counting how many things that used to belong to me have disappeared from this house." The air dropped instantly. I turned to look at Kendra. For example, my mother's walnut cabinet, or my father's rocking chair. Kendra sighed, putting on a reasonable tone. "Mom, we're just trying to brighten the house up a bit. Those old things don't match the style anymore." I said nothing, cut a small piece of meat, and chewed very slowly. It felt like even the meat in my mouth knew I was waiting for something. Elliot set his glass down and cut in with a voice that tried to sound neutral. "Kendra and Derek are very considerate, but perhaps they need more control over managing the household finances. Young people have their own way, Mrs. Steele." That was my moment. I set my knife and fork down, wiped my hands with the napkin, then opened my handbag. The envelope Attorney Webb had given me slid out, thick and heavy, and I placed it right in the center of the table. "In that case," I said, my voice soft as a breeze, "let's make everything a bit clearer tonight." Every pair of eyes turned directly to me. If you were sitting in the one empty chair at that table right now, whose side would you be on? The 65-year-old mother who had been pushed down into a storage room, gathering the remains of her memories like trash? Or the smiling young couple talking about convenience, new ways of managing, and full-service retirement homes? Sometimes, family dinners aren't about sharing food at all. They're where people reveal who they really are under warm yellow light. I opened the envelope, took out the letter printed on Webb and Associates law firm letterhead, and placed it neatly in front of me. "This is a legal notice," I said, my tone even. "From now on, Derek and Kendra will sign a formal lease with a rent of $1,650 per month. At the same time, the two of you will repay the $86,400 withdrawn from my account over the past 8 months, over 48 months, with a 2% interest rate." The wine glass in Elliot's hand tilted, red wine spilling onto the tablecloth. Lorraine held her breath. Derek froze. Kendra let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You really didn't have to go this far," she said acidly. "I didn't think you'd turn family into a spreadsheet like some professional manipulator." I lifted my head and looked straight into Kendra's eyes, long enough that she had to swallow. "I was an accountant," I said clearly. "Yes, and I'm also the only person listed as the owner of this house." I took out my phone, opened the Kendra file folder, then turned the screen so everyone could see. My father's rocking chair appeared on the screen, the scratch on the armrest exactly as it was in my memory, with the caption, "Sold, $650. "Lorraine," I said slowly, "if this scene looks familiar, that's because it should. Your daughter sold it, along with many other things." The atmosphere thickened. Derek's hand shook as he set his glass down. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the truth," I replied, "and I've documented everything. Statements, receipts, sale listings. I don't need to scream. I just need evidence." Elliot's face flushed. He shot to his feet. "You're threatening my daughter in our own home?" he snapped. I tilted my head slightly, my voice so calm that even I found it strange. "Wrong. This is still my home, and this envelope is the last chance for my son and his wife to go on living here. with a minimum amount of dignity. No one answered. The wall clock ticked, ticked, as if counting down to the moment everything would explode. Kendra let out a short, harsh laugh. "Pathetic," she said. "You think you can scare me with a few pieces of paper? I'm pregnant, and you're throwing a pregnant woman out of the house. Does that make you feel inhuman?" I leaned back in my chair, my eyes never leaving her face. "Is that so?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then when are you going to show me the pregnancy results?" The question hit the table with the weight of a brick. Silence. Derek turned to his wife, his gaze confused. I thought you told me." Kendra shot up from her chair, slamming her spoon onto the table. "I don't have to prove anything to anyone. You just want to tear us apart." I didn't argue further. I looked at Derek, the son I had spent my whole life protecting, with a gaze that was sad, but no longer weak. "Son," I said softly, "I've lost too much because of my silence. From now on, I will not be silent anymore." The room sank into stillness. Elliot hurriedly grabbed his coat, muttered something under his breath, and pulled Lorraine away from the table. Kendra stood there, face pale, lips trembling. Derek seemed frozen, unable to say a single word. I stood up, slipped the envelope back into my handbag, and spoke slowly. "I'll leave the letter on the kitchen counter. You have 48 hours to read and sign it." With that, I turned and left the dining room. Behind me, the sound of dishes clinking together rang out, the sound of a family dinner shattering, like ice cracking beneath your feet. Going down the stairs, I no longer felt myself shaking. Instead, there was a strange, weightless feeling. Maybe because, for the first time in many years, the scales had begun to tip toward what was right. I stepped into the storage room, the place that had once been used to humiliate me, now my strategic headquarters, and sat down on the edge of the folding mattress, looking out the tiny window. Outside, a light rain began to fall, like thin streaks of ash after a long, smoldering fire. But inside me, another kind of fire was burning, clear, steady, no longer flickering. And I understood all too well, the real battle was only just beginning. That night, the whole house sank into a silence as heavy as ash after an emotional explosion. I thought everything had ended with Kendra's thrown spoon and the exhausted look in my son's eyes. But close to midnight, a soft knock sounded at the storage room door. 3 knocks, hesitant, weak. I turned on the light. The door in front of me trembled faintly. "Mom, it's me." Derek's voice was hoarse, worn out, as if he had been crying for hours. I opened the door. Derek stood there, thinner, his eyes red and sunken. The warm yellow light fell across the face that had once been so bright, now marked by early lines and a lost, pitiful confusion. "I can't sleep," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm scared of losing the house, Mom. I don't know what to do." I stood in front of my 36-year-old son, a grown man I had once believed would be as strong as his father. A part of me wanted to pull him into my arms, but another part held the line I had just drawn. "I don't want to throw anyone out of the house," I said slowly. "That's why I gave you the lease agreement. If I wanted revenge, I would have changed the locks long ago." Derek lowered his head, his hands clenched tightly as if trying to hold on to something slipping away from him. "Kendra, she said if we lose this house, she'll leave me." His voice cracked. "I don't want a divorce. I'm scared. I'll lose everything." I looked at the son who once promised, as a little boy, "I'll take care of you like Dad does." Now he was like an overgrown child, trapped between his fears and a wife who knew exactly how to manipulate him. I sat down on the edge of the bed and motioned for him to sit across from me. "Derek, tell me the truth. Who sold your father's rocking chair? Who told you to withdraw the money?" A long silence. "Kendra," he exhaled. "She said, 'Your old stuff makes the house look poor.' She said her friends would laugh if they saw it." It felt like someone twisted a cold knife in my chest. "And what about you?" I asked. "I knew it was wrong," he admitted, his voice tightening. "But I didn't dare argue. She threatened to tell everyone that you control the money, that I don't have a say. I didn't want people to think I'm useless." I closed my eyes. Every word hit the ground like a heavy stone. Suddenly, I understood. Kendra hadn't just taken the money. She had taken my son's backbone too. And part of that was my fault. I thought back to when Derek was little. The time he accidentally kicked in the neighbor's window, I paid and apologized. The time he was short on tuition, I paid. The time he wanted to quit his job because his boss was strict, I gave him advice, but still let him run from it instead of learning how to face it. I had thought love meant absolute protection. But the truth was, I had unintentionally taught him that someone would always clean up his mess. So when someone else did it by using fear, he didn't know how to stand up. "Derek," I said, my voice low and sorrowful. "I used to think loving you meant shielding you, but I was wrong." He bowed his head, his shoulders trembling slightly. "Mom, I don't want to lose you." I looked deep into his eyes. "If you truly don't want to lose me, tomorrow you have to sign the contract. No negotiation. I only ask one thing, respect. And if you let anyone take even one more cent from my accounts, you'll be the one pushing yourself out of my life." Derek nodded, tears falling onto his clenched hands. "I understand. I'll do it." "No, you have to do it." "If you were me, what would you do in this moment? Forgive because he is your child? Or hold the line to save his future?" There are moments when a mother's love is not a pair of arms around her child, but a pair of hands that must push that child onto the path he needs to walk. We sat in silence for a few minutes. The clock in the living room ticked steadily, sounding like someone counting the breaths of the entire house. When Derek finally stood, his shadow stretched long and shaky across the floor. "I know you're right," he whispered. "I just don't know if I'm brave enough to face Kendra." He walked away, each step as heavy as stone. I watched him go, my heart sinking, not out of anger, but from sorrow for a son who was lost inside his own home. His bedroom door closed. Another kind of silence descended. I sat for a long time in the dark, recognizing a bitter truth. Sometimes, a mother's love is a double-edged sword. It can protect, but it can also soften someone so much that they forget they once knew how to stand tall. I picked up my phone and texted Attorney Webb. "Tomorrow morning at 9 they'll come. Prepare the contracts." After sending it, I turned off the main light, leaving only the desk lamp on. The warm, dim light washed over the small voice recorder with its red light blinking. It had been recording the entire evening. I had barely lain down when I heard soft footsteps on the floor upstairs. A door opened gently. Then Kendra's voice, low but sharp as a blade, cut through the thin wall of the storage room. "I told you already. Just a few more months. Once that old woman signs all the papers, I'll say I had a miscarriage. No one can blame me." A pause. Then a man's voice over the phone, deep, muffled. "Are you sure?" Kendra answered immediately, icy. "Absolutely. This house is worth putting up with a bit longer." I froze. Each word dripped into me like acid. A miscarriage. A plan. A fully rehearsed performance. The pregnancy Derek believed in so completely, very likely had never existed at all. I didn't jump up, didn't scream, didn't cry. I lay still, my eyes wide open in the dark. My heart pounded so loudly it sounded like drums in my ears. One part of me shattered for my son's pain, but another part, the coldest part, turned to steel. I glanced at the voice recorder. The red light was still blinking steadily. I knew the entire conversation had been captured. The storage room was still cold, but inside me, a fire was rising, slow, but very clear. No longer the hot, reckless kind of anger, but the cold resolve of a mother who has been pushed to the very edge. I pulled the blanket over myself and whispered into the darkness. "Keep going, Kendra. Keep lying. Keep plotting. This old mother is not as foolish as you think." Outside the window, the rain began to fall steadily. Each drop sounded like it was counting down the minutes until dawn, the dawn when justice would begin to speak. 2 days after I was discharged from the hospital, on a damp, cold morning, my phone rang. A familiar female voice, hesitant, trembling, as if trying to hold back something heavy, spoke. "Mrs. Steele, this is Lorraine Lowell, Kendra's mother. We need to talk, just the two of us." I froze for a beat. Lorraine, the woman who had sat across from me at the family dinner with that smug look, always treating me like a burden, now sounded urgent. I was silent for a few seconds before replying. "I'm listening." She lowered her voice. "Not over the phone. I'll text you the address of a cafe 10 minutes from your house. Don't tell anyone, not even Derek." Her voice shook, completely unlike the cold, polished woman I had seen before. I agreed, partly out of curiosity, partly because my instincts whispered, "This matters, a lot." Magnolia and Brew Cafe sat on a small street shaded by bright yellow flame trees. I arrived 10 minutes early, but Lorraine was already there. No makeup, no jewelry, hair tied back, a gray sweater making her look far more drained than the glamorous woman from that dinner. When I pulled out the chair, she only nodded slightly. No small talk, no pretense. In front of her lay a light brown envelope, thick, one corner creased. Lorraine pushed it toward me, her eyes drifting away. "I don't know where to begin," she whispered, "but there are things. If I don't say them, I won't sleep." I stared at the envelope, my fingers touching the edge. It felt warm, like it had been carrying a secret for far too long. "About Kendra?" I asked. Lorraine nodded, head bowed. "Yes, about everything she has done, and everything she can never do." I opened the envelope. Inside were medical records, credit card statements, screenshots of texts, pages stamped with the logo of a fertility clinic in California. I turned the first page. IVF cycle failed, November 2019. Patient unable to conceive naturally, suggested alternative treatments. I looked up. Lorraine's hands were clenched around her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "She can't have children," she said softly. "We found out 4 years ago." She swallowed hard, her voice warping. "Kendra hid it from everyone, even Derek. When I asked why she wouldn't tell the truth, she just laughed and said, 'Because if I tell the truth, no one will stay.'" Each word punched straight into my chest. Lorraine handed me the screenshots. Cold, calculated text glared back at me. "I'll say I'm 3 months pregnant. Easy. I just have to buy fake tests online. After a few months, I'll say I had a miscarriage. Who's going to check? Mom, you just need to act shocked. They'll feel sorry for us. Then we'll get the house." If you're listening to this, ask yourself, when someone uses life and the pain of losing a child as a tool to get what they want, what limits do they even have? What do you think Ramona should do? Forgive, because everyone has their reasons? Or accept that some people, even ones called family, can be the most dangerous liars of all? My hands began to shake. The coffee in front of me had gone cold without me noticing. I looked at Lorraine, feeling both anger and an emptiness spreading through me. She pulled out a tissue, wiping her tears. "I know you think I'm just as awful as she is, but I can't stay silent anymore. Kendra is addicted to shopping. She's over $42,000 in credit card debt. We, Elliot and I, have bailed her out 4 times, and she still keeps going." Her fingers trembled. "Elliot doesn't know about this. If he found out, it would crush him. He's always believed his daughter is perfect." I set the envelope down, my voice low but steady. "Why tell me? You could have stayed quiet. I would never have known." Lorraine looked up, her eyes swollen, clouded with sleeplessness. Because I can't watch her destroy someone else's life again. I've stayed still for too long. I owe you, and I owe my daughter one moment of truth. We sat in silence for several minutes. The clink of spoons, the whir of the coffee grinder, the chatter around us, all faded. Only 2 heavy breaths remained. One from a woman betrayed by her daughter-in-law, and one from a woman betrayed by her own child. Right then, Ariel walked into the cafe. I had told my daughter to meet me, only saying I needed a witness. She came over, squeezed my shoulder, then politely shook Lorraine's hand. Without needing much explanation, I pushed the envelope toward her. Ariel opened it, took out her phone, and began photographing each page: the medical records, the IVF results, the text messages, the debt statements. "Mrs. Lorraine, thank you," Ariel said gently but firmly. "We'll send everything to Attorney Webb. He'll know how to protect my mother." Lorraine nodded, her voice cracking. "I don't want lawsuits. I just want this to stop. If Kendra keeps going, she'll lose everything." I exhaled, feeling a swirl of emotions inside: anger, pity, and a hollow ache, like the image of family I had been clinging to had just shattered. This wasn't victory. This was liberation from delusion. All those times I wondered, am I being too harsh? Is Kendra really pregnant? Those questions dissolved like fog when the sun rises. Ariel put her phone away, holding my hand. "Mom, let's go home." I rose, turning to Lorraine one last time. "Thank you. I know this wasn't easy." She nodded, tears sliding down her nose. "No, Ramona. I should be the one thanking you. At least now, someone knows I still have a conscience." On the drive home, the Houston wind rushed through the cracked window, carrying the damp scent of an incoming storm. Ariel drove in silence. I sat in the passenger seat, holding the envelope against my chest. The papers inside rustled softly whenever the car bumped, reminding me that all those lies now had shape, signatures, stamps, numbers, proof. I opened my phone and typed quickly to Attorney Webb. "There is now medical and financial evidence of Kendra's fraud. I will send the supplemental files shortly." Sent. The screen lit, then went dark. Outside, the trees along the road had begun to change color. Houston autumn is always like that, beautiful in a melancholy way, the kind of beauty that comes only after too much has fallen. Ariel glanced over and asked quietly, "Mom, do you feel relieved?" I gave a thin smile. Not relieved. Clear. Relief comes when everything is over, but this is only the beginning. Less than a month after Derek filed for divorce and Attorney Webb submitted the compensation claim, Kendra launched her first counterattack. One early winter morning, my phone buzzed. It was Webb, calm, but with a hint of a restrained laugh in his voice. "Mrs. Steele, Kendra just filed a countersuit. She's accusing Derek of emotional abuse and is demanding $120,000. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. Not surprised, just tired. I knew it. People like Kendra, when the truth slips out of their hands, they invent a new story to regain control. Webb scheduled a meeting for the next morning. When I arrived, he already had every piece of evidence laid out across his desk: bank statements, antique sale listings, the recording of her fake miscarriage plan, and the messages Ariel had collected. "I filed everything with the court before they could process her countersuit," Webb said. "Now we just wait for the hearing." On the day of the hearing, a thin mist fell over Houston, like a quiet breath over the city. The courtroom was small, but the air inside felt thick, ritualistic, a place where truth would be weighed. Kendra sat across from us, pale, dark circles under her eyes, trying desperately to maintain composure. Beside her was a young attorney, crisp suit, confident posture, like he believed this was a simple classroom exercise. Derek sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. I sat right behind him, between Ariel and Malcolm, the three of us, moving through a battlefield without needing to exchange a single word. Kendra was the first to speak. Her voice shook. a crafted mix of anger and rehearsed fragility. Derek Steele, pushed me into emotional crisis for months. He controlled all finances, insulted me, and his mother forced me out of the house. I'm pregnant, and they treated me like trash. I looked toward the judge, a woman in her 60s, calm but sharp-eyed. She nodded, then signaled for Attorney Webb. Webb rose to his feet. His voice was deep, steady, each word hitting like a hammer on steel. Your Honor, this is the bank statement showing $86,400 withdrawn without permission over an 8-month period. He presented another document. This is the online listing for the walnut rocking chair, matching property owned by the plaintiff, Mrs. Ramona Steele. And here is the audio recording in which Miss Kendra Lowell admits to faking a pregnancy and planning a staged miscarriage to gain access to the Steele family's assets. The courtroom fell dead silent. I heard the faint clatter of a pen falling from the clerk's desk. Kendra dropped her gaze, lips pressed into a trembling line, fury flashing in her eyes. The judge adjusted her glasses and opened the file. Miss Lowell, do you deny this evidence? Kendra stammered. I was framed. My mother hates me. It's all fabricated. If you are listening to this, ask yourself, when lies are exposed before the law, why do some people fight back not with truth, but by blaming the very person who gave them life? That's no longer desperation. That is who they are. And the harshest truth is this: not every villain is made by circumstance. Some choose it. Just then, the courtroom door opened. Lorraine Lowell walked in, exhausted, eyes swollen, holding a large envelope. She walked straight to the witness stand. Her voice trembled, but it held firm. I am Lorraine Lowell, Kendra's mother. I confirm everything Attorney Webb stated is true. My daughter lied about being pregnant, spent beyond her means, and deceived both our family and the Steele family. Kendra whipped around. Mother? What are you doing? Lorraine swallowed her tears. Because you won't stop. Because I have helped you lie one too many times. Silence washed over the room again. I looked toward the back. Elliot Lowell sat slumped, covering his face with his hands. A man watching the image of his perfect daughter collapse. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. The court rejects all damage claims filed by Miss Kendra Lowell. The rental agreement and repayment plan between Mrs. Ramona Steele and Mr. Derek Steele are legally recognized. The court also acknowledges evidence of credit fraud and is forwarding the matter to law enforcement for further investigation. Webb gave me a small nod, barely noticeable, but enough to say, "It's done." I exhaled, not triumphant, not joyful, just lighter, as if someone had lifted a weight that had been crushing me for months. A week later, the Houston newspapers ran a headline: Police expand credit fraud investigation involving Kendra Lowell after additional victims report false borrowing and unauthorized purchases. I read the article without satisfaction. It felt like watching someone teeter on the edge of a cliff, knowing you can't pull them back anymore. That afternoon, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, there stood Elliot Lowell, hat in hand, shoulders slumped, a man who suddenly looked decades older. His voice was raw. I came to apologize, Mrs. Steele. Lorraine told me everything. I'm disappointed, but I know you gave Kendra more chances than we ever did. I nodded gently. You don't need to apologize. You're a victim too. He squeezed my hand, his grip trembling, heavy with sorrow. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the cold of late season. A father who had just lost the thing he once believed was the best part of his life. Time passed slowly, and the house finally regained its natural, peaceful rhythm. Every month, Derek sent me $1,650 in rent and $1,800 in repayment, as punctual as a clock. With each transfer, he left a short but sincere message. March. Still trying. May. Mom, I've started over. I saved every message in a separate folder. Not for the money, but because each line felt like a seed pushing through rubble, slow, but always reaching for the light. One afternoon, Webb visited. He handed me the court's final ruling. "The court has granted all of your compensation claims. You can rest easy now, Ramona. From here on out, no one can touch your assets." I simply smiled, a small, peaceful smile. "Thank you, Webb. All I want now is quiet. The law has spoken for me." Every morning, I practiced the breathing exercise my therapist taught me. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 7, exhale for 8. It sounded simple, but helping a once-broken heart find its steady rhythm again was anything but easy. I began walking in the Houston rain, a sound I once hated, but that now felt like a companion. The steady patter was like a soft drumbeat, reminding me that life was still moving, and so was I. There are moments in healing when you don't feel yourself moving forward. No footsteps, no shifting shadow. But strangely, when you look back, you realize you've traveled farther than you thought. That was the stage I was living through. No noise, no grand victories, just small, quiet improvements, steady stitches mending each crack inside me. The front garden, once turned into a battlefield by Kendra, the place where my mother's wedding dress was thrown like trash, was now being restored. I planted it again, lavender and white daisies, my mother's 2 favorite flowers. As I placed each root into the soil, a cold tremor ran through my hands. But it was real. It was alive. And with every root I pressed into the earth, I felt one more fissure in my heart knit itself back together. On breezy evenings, I sat with a cup of hot tea and listened to the rain on the roof tiles. No more arguments, no more cold, calculating voice of Kendra. Just my heartbeat, slow, steady, peaceful. On weekends, Ariel and Malcolm came home to visit. Ariel brought a large box. Mom said she misses Grandpa's rocking chair. I couldn't find the old one, so I bought a new one. Maybe someday it'll become Grandma Ramona's chair in our memories. I sat down. It creaked softly, a gentle sound that made my eyes sting. I closed my eyes and could almost hear my father's laugh, my mother's lullaby drifting across the porch like years ago. Malcolm carefully restored the pieces of my parents' wedding photo frame, the one Kendra had stepped on. He glued them back one by one and coated it with a new protective layer. "Look, Mom," he said, "sometimes things that were broken become even more precious because they're held together by love." I looked at the photo. The tiny cracks remained, like folds of time, but my parents' eyes in the picture seemed bright, as if smiling to comfort me. Tears fell before I could stop them. Derek also began therapy. One afternoon as we walked along the park, he said, "They're helping me recognize manipulation. I can say no now, Mom." I looked at my son, emotions swirling. "You have your own boundaries now." "And I'm learning to protect them," he said. "Not just with others, but with myself." I looked at Derek, a man learning to walk again on emotional legs, scarred but still moving forward. One Sunday afternoon, I invited Mrs. Viola Sharp, the woman who called 911 and saved my life, for tea. She was still as small as the day I met her, but her gentle eyes held so much strength. "Ramona, you're looking better," she smiled. "I owe you more than a thank you," I said. "If it weren't for you that day." She placed her hand over mine, warm and very real. "Oh no, I just did what someone should do. You living well, that's what makes me happy." We sat on the porch, the wind carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. 2 women, 2 cups of tea, 2 lives once shaken, now calm and steady again. On Sunday night, all 3 of my children sat down to have dinner with me. I cooked chicken soup exactly the way my mother used to, sprinkled with a little black pepper. The scent filled the kitchen, warm enough that just standing there made my heart soften. After the meal, Ariel took out my sister's poetry collection, the sister I lost right before everything began. We gathered around the table, taking turns reading the words she once wrote. Home is not a shelter, but the place we dare to return to after every breaking. No one spoke, but we all understood. My sister had been right. A house is not truly yours because your name is on its deed. It only belongs to you when you are strong enough to stand in it after all the fractures and no longer be afraid. That night, under the small lamp on the old wooden table, I spread out my papers and rewrote my will. I divided my assets evenly, 1 share for each child, but added a clear condition. Whoever maintains respect and boundaries will keep their share. No one is allowed to manipulate, lie, or use love as a hostage in exchange for money. I also set aside a small amount for a local center supporting victims of financial abuse, those who are pressured, controlled, or treated as tools for someone else's gain. I knew there were many people like me. Older folks turned into financial resources for someone's greed. If my story could help someone find the courage to speak up, then perhaps what I endured was not entirely meaningless. When I finished writing, I folded the will and placed it inside my mother's wooden box, along with her old wedding shawl and our family photograph. It was more than a legal document. It was the final message I wanted to leave for the people I loved. Love is expansive, but boundaries must be clear. Night fell. I returned to my bedroom, warm, with soft yellow light spread across the walls like a gentle blanket. The window was slightly open, carrying in the scent of damp pine and spring rain. The new rocking chair creaked softly. Raindrops tapped a steady rhythm on the porch roof. I placed my hand on my parents' wedding photo, the lamp's reflection making their faces look as if they were gazing at me. Calm, reassuring. For the first time in many years, I closed my eyes without carrying fear. No more jolting awake at the sound of a door. No more holding my breath at footsteps in the hallway. No more feeling like a guest in my own home. Everything had finally returned to its rightful place. In that moment, I understood. Justice, kindness, and respect are the 3 pillars that hold up this roof. It took nearly a lifetime to learn how to protect them. But in the end, I did. And that night, I slept soundly in my own room, in the scent of damp pine, and a peace no one could ever take away again. A year after the day I found my belongings scattered across the lawn, I stood in that very spot, the garden once soaked in mud and tears, watering each lavender plant. The lavender scent drifted through the cool, moist air, gentle as a quiet blessing. I knelt, touched the earth, and whispered just 2 words. It's over. Not a triumphant cheer, but a period, a closing sentence to a long year of loss and healing. The final news about Kendra arrived in early spring. The court handed down a suspended sentence, issued a restraining order against her, and required restitution to the other victims she had borrowed from under false pretenses. I felt no joy, no thrill, no lingering rage, only a quiet emptiness, like standing inside your home, watching a storm lash at the windows, and then walk away, leaving long streaks of water across the frame. Derek finished paying off everything he owed me 6 months early. He didn't call to announce it, didn't explain, didn't justify. He simply kept sending the payments, on time, consistently, until the final message appeared. August, completed. Thank you, Mom. I read it and smiled. A sincere apology sometimes doesn't need the words, I'm sorry. It lives in action, in persistence, in refusing to run away from responsibility. And Derek did exactly that. That afternoon, the whole family gathered in the living room to set up a small memorial table for my sister. Ariel lit the candles. Malcolm placed the framed photo. Derek brought white chrysanthemums. I told them stories about their grandfather's rocking chair, how he used to sit there on winter nights, rocking my sister to sleep, his voice shaky but warm. One story led to another, weaving our generations closer, not just by blood, but by the memories and love we chose to preserve. When the candles burned low, I looked at my children and said, "Dignity is not a gift you hand over to anyone. Boundaries are not coldness. They are love with clarity. Whoever walks over your boundaries without asking does not truly love you." Ariel nodded, eyes shining. Malcolm squeezed my hand and whispered, "I think today you just taught us the most important lesson of our lives." The next morning, I swept the dry leaves in the yard, clearing the last trace of rain on the porch, and as I bent down to pick up each leaf, I realized it wasn't just the house that had been cleaned. My life had been reset as well. No more lies hidden behind false smiles. No more suspicious eyes watching my every move. No more heaviness when my hand touched a doorknob. I had cleared the poison out of my life, with the law, with patience, and with a belief that honest people may lose a few battles, but they never lose their whole life. That night, I opened my laptop and wrote a public post about financial abuse within families, a topic few want to discuss, but many silently suffer from. I told my story. No names, no extra wounds, no hate, just the journey of a 65-year-old woman who stood up within the bounds of the law, protected her home, her assets, her heart, and still kept her kindness. When I clicked send, I felt something lift. Somewhere out there, maybe someone would read it and think, if she could do it at her age, maybe I can start doing something for myself too. Before bed, I opened the new wooden cabinet Malcolm built for me. Inside, I placed my mother's wedding shawl, the one dragged across the lawn, now washed, pressed, and smelling faintly of lavender. I ran my hand along each fold, as if touching time itself. That shawl had witnessed generations of women in my family, those who endured, those who rose, those who learned to love themselves without surrendering dignity. Now it was my turn. I closed the cabinet, stepped onto the porch, and watched Houston's rain fall, each drop like a silver thread sewn into the night. Rain hit the railing, glimmering under the warm porch light. I breathed in deeply, warmth spreading across my chest. Every wound, every storm, eventually becomes part of a survivor's story. Inside me, a sentence rose, soft but unwavering. Not just for myself, but for anyone who has ever been hurt, ever been called selfish for choosing themselves. If they call your strength selfish, smile. Because maybe that was the moment you saved your own life. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. If you're still listening now, perhaps somewhere in these lines you saw yourself or the shadow of someone who once hurt you. Life sometimes makes us walk through loss just to teach us one lesson. Self-love is not selfish. It is the foundation on which every other kind of love can stand. I believe every wound can turn into light as long as we never abandon our dignity and our kindness. And now I'm truly curious. Where in the world are you listening from? Leave me a comment. Tell me your city, a boundary you've learned to build, or something that helped you rise after days when you thought you had nothing left. If this story touched you, a like, a comment, or hitting the subscribe button will help it reach someone else who needs to hear. They are not alone. They still have the right to start over, and they deserve respect. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for listening, for understanding, and for staying with me to the last word. Sometimes just one person willing to hear a story all the way through is enough to save a life.